Hey Sun Space Sun, I'm Barbie. I'm Daisy Victoria, or Daisy Barbie Victoria. Anyway, I'm going to show you how I recreated Holiday Barbie 2022's dress. This year's Holiday Barbie is dressed up in this beautiful red ball gown, which is clearly inspired by the poinsettia flower. So she's kind of a poinsettia princess. And I love how there are several variations of Barbie this year. In addition to those, there's also a red-haired Barbie, which was a Walmart exclusive this year, and she's also very cool. I decided to use a red bridal satin for this project. I bought this satin off of Amazon, so I'll leave a link to where I got this specific one if you like it yourself. It's a pretty good weight and it's got a little shine to it, but it's not like crazy shiny. So starting out, Holiday Barbie has all these petals on her skirt and I wanted to get the ratio right. Now I know Barbie doesn't have exactly human proportions, but we can do our best. So I measured that out and then did a few calculations and tried to figure out about how long I wanted my skirt petals to be. I also did a quick sketch of just how I was going to put the dress together, what the layers were going to be, so I could kind of get it straight in my head. So just a little bit of planning before I went into the actual process here. I went ahead and started patterning the petals for the skirt. So basically I have this big petal pattern and I'm going to need 6 petals that are longer and then 6 petals that are shorter. So I'm going to gather up the petals and I'm making each petal individually. So I'm just getting sort of a preliminary right here, and that way I'll be able to drape it over the skirt once I have the skirt and kind of figure it all out. I decided to do the skirt as a circle skirt. Now I've made circle skirts before on my channel, so I'm not going to go through like the exact how-to of a circle skirt, but basically I'm making a big circle. So I calculated based on circle math what I want the radius of my circle to be. So I took my waist, I guess I will tell you kind of how I'm making it. So my waist measurement, or wherever I want the skirt to sit, which for me this time is at my waist, then I divided that by pi, which gives me the diameter, divided that in half, which gives me the radius. And then, so I'm measuring the total length of the skirt plus the radius, and I'm making like a big circle around the bottom, and then I'm cutting out that radius at the top. So it'll make like a circle with a hole in it. And this had to be done in pieces. So I've got actually 2 half circles that I'm sewing together. And then I am going to put a tulle layer over this, but the tulle layer I'm going to cut as just one big rectangle, making sure that it's wide enough to be at least as wide, but actually a little bit wider than the bottom of the skirt. And then I'm going to gather that into the top. And I went ahead and told you all of that up front, so I could also tell you while I'm making this skirt some interesting facts about the poinsettia, because I was so interested, like, how did the poinsettia actually become a Christmas flower? I've always kind of known it as like a holiday / Christmas flower, right? And I was like, where did it actually come from? Like, how did it become associated with Christmas? And I did find the answer. Poinsettias are found natively in Mexico, and they were actually used by the ancient Aztecs. So this predates Christmas and Christianity, actually, when the Aztecs used poinsettias, which they called back then Quetzalcoatl, which I think is such a beautiful name. So the Aztecs used Quetzalcoatl as dyes for different types of fibers, as well as also medicinally. It was during the 17th century when Spanish Franciscan priests in Mexico began to use the Quetzalcoatl as a Christmas time flower. And at that time, it actually became known as Flor de Nochebuena, or the flower of Christmas Eve. They weren't called poinsettias until later on in 1825, when Joel Poinsett, who was an ambassador to Mexico from the US, decided to bring back some of these plants to cultivate in his home in South Carolina. And because his name was Poinsett, that was where they got the English name later, poinsettia. So just a little bit of history if you too, like me, are a very inquisitive nerd who was wondering, what is the history of a poinsettia? Now you know. So back to the dress. I do want to note here that I did a rolled hem on my serger for the satin skirt. That's a really easy way to hem a circle skirt because it's a little bit finicky to do the fold over hem. And I think that the rolled hem looks really nice. It gives it a nice little textured finish, and I really like that. So onto the tulle layer. This is just one big old rectangle of tulle, which I am gathering up into the waistband. I could cut another circle skirt of tulle if I wanted to. I could cut different numbers of panels. I could do all kinds of things, but I like to make my life easier. And definitely working with tulle, I thought it was easier to go ahead and cut one big rectangle. So doing this, I decided to space it into little sections. So I wanted to gather it evenly. So I folded it in half and then in quarters and then in eighths. And then that way I can make sure that I basically gather each section of tulle into the appropriate corresponding section of satin skirt. I started out by doing some gathering stitches on my machine, so my plan was to go ahead and gather that way into the skirt. At this point, I am trying my skirt on my mannequin here. So I'm putting this over a petticoat, and that is what's giving it the volume. You can also use a hoop skirt, but I just felt like using the petticoat today. So pleased with that result. It is time to move on with finishing up the skirt. Now, I did not cut the tulle to the proper length so far. I just used the full length of the bolt, which happened to be longer than the length of my skirt. So that allows me to go ahead and drape it on the mannequin here and then cut off the excess tulle. So I'm basically just making sure that the tulle is the right length for the skirt after I've already draped it. You can obviously pre-cut the tulle before you sew it onto the skirt, but the benefit of this is that you get a more exact drape. So if anything varies here or there in the gathering height or whatever, you can make it a little bit more perfect and you just have a little bit more control over it. Sometimes I cut it to length before I gather it on. It's just kind of up to the preference of the project and how I am feeling that day. For the waistband, this is pretty much a standard waistband that I've shown you guys before on other projects. It's a big rectangle of cloth, and then I am pinning that onto the top of the skirt, so covering all of those gathering stitches. And then once I have that pinned on there, I go ahead and sew that down. And then after it's sewn, I go ahead and fold it over on itself and fold that over towards the back or the inside. And I make sure that I fold over the ends as well so that those are finished off. There are a number of ways that you can add a closure to this skirt. For this particular one, I decided to add ribbon ties. So I'm just sewing those ribbon ties into the ends of the waistband. Okay, so now it's time to take care of all the flower petals for our poinsettia / Quetzalcoatl princess dress. And to do that, I am cutting out all the individual petals from my bridal satin. And remember, I've got 6 that are the full or the longer length, and then I've got 6 that are the shorter length. So I'm using one pattern that I've marked on the pattern where the cutoff is for the shorter ones. And then all of these petals are going to be finished off on the edge with a rolled hem using my serger. So again, that gives it a really nice little texture there on the edge that's kind of like a defined edge piece, and I really like the way it looks. You can singe the ends of polyester, and this is a polyester satin, so I went ahead and singed that very bottom corner on each petal just to give it that extra little bit of finished assurance. The next tricky / fun part is gathering up all of these petals together. So we notice that the petals kind of overlap each other on the poinsettia and also on Barbie's dress itself. So what I'm doing is laying out the longer petals, finding the center of each one, and then I'm laying a shorter petal on top of those, matching the ends of the shorter petal to the centers of the longer petals. And basically I just need to do that all the way around. So all 12 petals, 6 long and 6 short, need to be matched up that way. And I decided that for this skirt, I wanted it to be closed at the waistband, so that way it would be a little bit easier to sew all of these petals together. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just match them all the way around and then make a closed waistband. So what I did next was I actually gathered the petals up into the waistband. So the waistband is quite a bit bigger than my waist, but it's not as big as the full width of the petals because I made them quite wide. So what I'm doing here to gather up the petals is, remember there are 6 sections basically, or 12, but we could just use 6. So I divided the waistband into those 6 sections as well, and then I am matching those up to the breaks in the petals, so that way I have an even area in the waistband that I need to gather each petal into. So it's the same idea as when I gathered the tulle onto the skirt. I just want to make sure that it's gathered pretty evenly all the way around. This one I did first sew gathering stitches onto it, but because I have such very thick fabric, it was being a little bit finicky and I snapped the gathering thread, and it only took me one time snapping it to decide that I was just going to do this by hand, because I completely trust myself to go ahead and gather it in by hand, and I knew that that would be faster for me than trying to futz with doing another gathering stitch. So real quickly I just kind of pushed the fabric in there using my fingers as the gathering tool, and I pinned the waistband down over the gathering stitches all the way along the skirt. And for this waistband, it's like the other one, except that I folded it over first because I'm basically attaching the finished folded waistband onto the skirt instead of sewing it on first and folding it over. So it's basically like a bias binding, but on the straight grain. So once that's sewn on there, I actually left an opening, and the reason I did that was so I could attach a drawstring. When I'm threading a drawstring through, this time I'm using a red satin ribbon because I happen to have some that matched. I like to first singe the end because this is polyester satin ribbon, so the ends will singe. That's really nice. And I like to use a safety pin and then safety pin through the ribbon, and then that way I can feed it through the waistband by using that safety pin as a little guide that I can feed all the way around. And tying the petal skirt on top of the circular satin plus tulle skirt, I think it looks really, really nice. Which means we are ready to move on to the top, which I decided to make as a real steel-boned corset. And that is my preference because I happen to love corsets and love making corsets. I'm making my corset from all the remaining red satin, so I went ahead and started by cutting the bias binding I'm going to use around the edge just to make sure I don't short myself on that. So to cut the bias binding, I basically folded the fabric on itself at a 45-degree angle, and then I cut the edge there, and then I like to use 2-inch bias binding. So what I'm doing is measuring 2 inches and then cutting little strips there. And that's just a really quick way that I like to make bias binding when I don't need very much. So I only need enough to bind the top and bottom edges of the corset here. So this is just a super quick way for me to get exactly what I need. I have a handy dandy corset pattern that I would like to use for this corset. So basically I'm tracing out my pieces here, and for each corset panel I need 2, so 1 for each side of the corset. And I'm gonna cut this out from 3 layers. I'm using this red satin, which by itself is not the solo structural layer for like a corset that's really gonna pull me in. So I'm also cutting out 2 more layers. One is from a cotton canvas. So this is actually a duck cloth that I'm using. And you can use a coutil as well, which is made specifically for corsetry. But for most applications, a cotton canvas or duck will work just fine. For the innermost layer, which is going to be against my skin, I usually like to use a cotton twill, but I went to the store to get some cotton twill and they didn't have red, so I went ahead and went with just a nice high quality regular weave cotton, and that will work out just fine for this dress. Oh, I also cut a modesty panel for the back. So sewing this corset together, I started at the center, and then I am doing a method where I basically like sew on each panel from there. And each time I'm adding in a waist tape, which just helps to stabilize the waist of the corset. So I do want to note that this video is not like a full-on corsetry instructional video. I have run a course on making a corset before, and I've considered running it again if there's interest. So if that's something you guys would be interested in, just leave a comment below and let me know. For now, I'm going to give you just like a quick little, here's how I do the seams, and this is basically how I'm doing every single seam. So I am sandwiching what I already have for the corset inside the next seam. So you can see I'm putting the lining underneath there, and then I'm going to put the fashion layer on top, and I'm catching the waist tape in each little piece. This is one way you can sew a corset together. This is not the only way. I've also done other methods before, but this is my favorite method because it just tends to give me the easiest, most consistent results with the least fuss and hassle. So what I'm doing here is pinning all of that together. So making a little corset seam sandwich with the existing piece inside the fashion and lining layers of the next piece. Then I am going to do the same thing on the other side. I like to do this like both of the corresponding sides kind of at the same time. It's just my little method. You could do one and then come back and do the other later or after it in sequence or whatever if you like. So I'm pinning both of those little corset seam sandwiches together, and then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew them together. After sewing them together, it is important to clip your seam allowance along any curves, and then very important to iron the seams flat. And then once you have those seams ironed flat, you can add your boning casing. So for this particular corset pattern, I'm creating a boning casing on each side of each seam. So that's really easy to do because you basically feed it through the machine with one seam on one side of that seam and another casing seam on the other side. And when you sew a corset with this method that I'm showing you, your seam allowance will be to one side. So one of those is going to be thicker than the other. So there's different methods of like cutting some of that seam allowance off if you have too much. If you don't mind the little ridge there, you can leave all of it. It's up to you and your aesthetic preference always. But just kind of giving you a few little tips and tricks here along the way if you want to see some of my favorite methods for corset making. After all of the corset panels are sewn together, then it's time to just finish off the back panel. So I folded in the fashion fabric and the lining fabric, and then I sewed that together and sewed boning channels, so one next to the edge, and then a space for grommets, and then another boning channel on the other side of that. And that makes it nice and secure back there. This corset pattern is a little bit longer than what I want this final corset to be. So what I did was I tried it on and marked where I want the bottom edge to be, and then I just went ahead and cut that off. So I'm just making sure that I cut off the same amount from both sides of the corset so we keep that symmetry. Next, I am binding one edge of the corset with bias binding. So I sewed that bias binding onto the edge of the corset, and then I'm folding it over on top of itself twice and securing it to the back side of the corset. And I do have a video about attaching bias binding to a corset, or really to anything. So if you want a more detailed instruction on that, I can link you to that as well. I always bind one edge of the corset. I typically like to do the bottom, and then I put the boning in and then bind the top edge of the corset after that. For the boning, I'm using 1/2 inch flat steel at the center front and also at the center back. This is the most rigid of the boning, and I'm using that on the seams that I want to be pretty rigid. Then I am using 1/4 inch flat steel on the seams, or the casings that are basically on the other side of where the grommets will go. That is also fairly rigid, so it's nice to have that flat right there. Throughout the rest of the corset, I am using 1/4 inch spiral steel boning. And each boning piece needs to be a little bit shorter than the length of your seam. So you want to have it to where it's nice and, rigid, supportive. In this case, it's spiral, so it has a little bend and curvature to it, which is important because these corset seams are very curved. You want the boning to be a little bit shorter than the length of the casing, so that way it's got a little room to kind of move around. It's got a little bit of give in there, so that way it won't poke through. Next, I am doing the grommets. They are evenly spaced along the back edges of the corset. I'm using a hand hammer grommet tool here and size 00 grommets. Next, it is time to insert the lacing ribbon for the corset. I do have a video teaching you more detailed how to do this, so if you want to learn that, I'll go ahead and link that to you as well. I'm doing what's sort of a standard bunny ears method, which leaves you what I guess looks kind of like bunny ears in the middle of the corset, and that allows you to tighten it at the waist. And by putting the stress point at the waist, that's what's going to allow the corset to most naturally pull in the waistline. And then finally, that brings us to the poinsettia flower detail that is on the bodice of Barbie's dress. To do that, I'm using tulle, and I decided to just go ahead and use the pieces I had cut off of the hem of the skirt. Very convenient. I made myself a little pattern here for the tulle flower petals, and I cut out 24 of those from my tulle. So that is a 4x thickness by 6 petals. Barbie also has this interesting strap across her bodice, and to create that strap, I just sewed a rectangular tube, and I ended up making it too wide at first because I knew that way I could cut it down and go ahead and make it a little bit narrower, so that way I was able to test the width and make sure it was exactly what I wanted. Next, I gathered up all of my poinsettia petals, or Quetzalcoatl petals, and I just did that by sticking them in a row 4x thickness by 6, and I sewed gathering stitches and then gathered them up. And what I did here is I gathered them as small as they would go, so I'm just gathering them in really tightly there. And then I tied the gathering stitches together, creating a little circle basically of all these flower petals. And then once I had that, I was able to hand stitch it a little bit to just kind of secure it the way that I wanted it to look. And next I sewed that flower onto the bodice strap, and then on the back of that I decided to put a pin in there so that way it's not permanently attached to the corset. I could unpin it as I like, so either it can be adjusted a little bit in length, or if I wanted to wear the corset without it for some reason, I could do that as well. Barbie's dress strap and bodice flower poof have glitter on them, so I decided to add some glitter. I'm using glitter glue, and then in addition to the glitter glue, I'm adding some more glitter. It's like a party glitter with different size flakes or flecks or whatever, and I'm using the glitter glue to adhere more of that. I tested it out on a scrap piece of satin before moving forward with the strap, and I liked how it looked, so I went ahead and did that. And this wasn't really very difficult. It just took a little bit of time and finesse to get the glitter applied on there how I wanted it. I also added glitter to the tulle petals in the flower, and once again I did that using both the glitter glue and the additional party time glitter. I don't think it's actually called party time glitter, but it was something like party glitter. Anyway, it's always a party when it's a Barbie dress, right? Because come on Barbie, let's go party. And pleased with this result, it was time to try it on the mannequin and see how everything looks together. I decided to replace the strap on the back of the corset. So what's really nice is that just meant I had to cut a little bit of it off, and then I re-sewed the pin back, and then I could pin that where I wanted it on the corset. And voila, I'm a Barbie girl. One of the many places that I like to go near where I live, I noticed set up a gingerbread village for the holiday season, and I'd really been eyeing that and enjoying it. So I knew that I wanted to take Barbie there to get some holiday photos. Hi, I'm Barbie. Welcome to my gingerbread house. I'm so excited. Now we're all decorated for the holidays here. We've got our candy canes and lots of frosting. It's so delicious, you almost want to eat it. And bonus, I also found my very own Ken. If you would like to continue seeing all the cool stuff I make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your bell notification, or don't and just see if you get lucky in the YouTube algorithm, whatever floats your boat. And if you would like to find me on all the social medias, I am Daisy Viktoria everywhere. And my website is daisyvictoria.com. And a special thank you to my patrons over on Patreon who help me so much to continue creating content. I hope you all have an absolutely magical day and a happy holiday season. with much love from Barbie. I will see you again real soon. Bye-bye.